that ring's sort of an interesting story, but because it was found decades ago. In fact, it was found even excavated slightly before the pilot stone was, but it was never cleaned and examined until recently. But you look at the pilot stone, that's in Latin, and then you look at this ring, and it's in Greek, and it's spelled exactly the same way as Pilate's name is in the Greek New Testament. So another great find, but also tells us that sometimes in archaeology things are discovered and then no one actually pays attention to them and examines them until many years later. So there's a lot out there waiting to be discovered and uncovered.
That means, if nothing else, for you, that's job security. There's always more to find, if nothing else.
Oh, yeah.
And so I'm looking forward to this interview because we were talking about it at the Discovery Institute event just down the road. And Stephen Meyer and I were talking about that. And I did not have a chance to meet Dr. Titus Kennedy because I believe his wife was having a baby at the time. But he is a field archaeologist. He is a research fellow with the Discovery Institute. Just down the road, he also teaches at Dallas Theological Seminary. I just watched an interview with him about that. Assistant professor of Bible exposition, a graduate of Biola University, University of Toronto, University of South Africa, an individual that has really been a speaker on a number of different campuses about this very important issue of archaeology. And this new book out, which is published by our friends at Harvest House, Archaeology and the People of the Bible, exploring the evidence for the historical existence of Bible characters. So, if nothing else, Titus Kennedy, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hey, glad to be here.
Sorry I didn't get a chance to meet you face-to-face, but maybe next time you come into Dallas to teach one of your courses here, we'll get a chance to get together. But we certainly appreciate the work that you have done. And I think it's illustrative of the fact that you have picked 130 different individuals. And the way you pick them, you have sort of a 5-point criteria for how these particular names end up in your book. Can you explain?
Yeah. So I really set out to put together a comprehensive list of everyone who's named in the Bible who is also attested in archaeological sources, people for which there is historical evidence for their existence outside of the Bible. So it's not so much that I chose 130, about 135 really is who I addressed in the book, but I tried to get every person that we know about. And there are probably a few others, 2, 3, 4, that I could have put in there, except that the evidence is really tenuous and very, very speculative, so I didn't want to stretch it. But the reason that I targeted this particular theme for this book is that if you talk to scholars, if you talk to the general public, many people, even those who are secular or skeptical of the Bible, they will concede that the Bible is a reliable geography book. And they will even say, yes, those cities existed, and maybe that city was destroyed, but it could just be a story that's set in a historical context. Mm-hmm. So we've got, some modern and some ancient compare and contrast examples that we could give. In the modern era, we've got things like comic books or superheroes like Spider-Man. All right, so Spider-Man is set in New York City. It's not like Superman that's set in fictional metropolis. Well, New York City obviously is a real city. You read the comic books, you look at the pictures, you see things like the Empire State Building. So it's a real place, it's a real historical setting, real buildings. But obviously Spider-Man is not a real person. Peter Parker's not a real person. So people understand the difference between historical context and fiction, or we could call it mythology. Now, if we go back in time, a more appropriate comparison, I think, for the Bible would be the writings of Homer, and specifically the Iliad. If we read through the Iliad, detailed descriptions of people and places and events, but if we really scrutinize it from a historical or archaeological perspective, we see that there are places like Mycenae. That's a real place mentioned in the Iliad. It was one of the major cities of the Mycenaean civilization. Troy was a real place. Heinrich Schliemann, those famous early archaeological excavations there. They even found that it was destroyed about the time that the Iliad says that war happened and the destruction of Troy. So maybe the event is reflected. But if we look at the characters themselves, there's no historical archaeological evidence for Achilles and for Hector and for Paris and all these different characters. Okay, so even though it's set in a real era and some real locations, it's still not a historical narrative. It's still mythology. And the difference between the Iliad and the Bible is that we do have the evidence for all these people that are named in the Bible who have the same name, the same title, the same occupation. They lived in the same place at the same time. And very often we even have situations where events or actions that are described in the Bible are corroborated by extra biblical evidence.
And so, again, I appreciate that because, as you pointed out, it is quite possible that we would certainly have some of these areas like those individuals or David and Isaiah or Sargon or Nebuchadnezzar or whatever, but those still could be mythological. So the reason I think this is such a significant book is you focus on some of those people and give us an opportunity to learn more. Again, you have more than 130 names. I picked out about 24 we might be able to get to, but I suspect probably will not get to all of those, but let's begin with an easy one, but one that I think surprises a lot of people, and that is David. I think most Americans, most Christians would think that we had historical evidence for David, yet you can go back a few decades even and find some people suggesting that, well, David was just a mythology of a good king and Saul was the bad king. So it was really a story of a bad king and a good king, but there really wasn't a David until we found some of the archaeological evidence. True?
Yeah, that's absolutely right. The issue of David's existence and archaeological discoveries is one of the best examples for not only turning the tables on a skeptical narrative about the Bible or biblical figures, but also for scholars changing their minds when there is clear archaeological evidence presented.
But I was just thinking for just a minute, Titus, as we were going to a break, you were, of course, talking about David and how that changed people's minds. We're going to get to the New Testament later, but you think about Luke in particular as historian, because Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke, but also the book of Acts. How many times there were skeptics that said Luke didn't get historical facts correct, and now you have books like Colin Hermer's book, The Book of Acts, and the setting of Hellenistic history, and others documenting that on every particular statement he makes, the skeptics were wrong and the Bible was right. And that's one of the good news of all the great archaeological discoveries, both in the Old and New Testament, don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And there was an interesting story of a scholar and archaeologist, Ramsay. He set out to actually disprove the book of Acts, Luke and Acts, and he was specifically really interested in Acts. And he thought that as he did more research and did more archaeological work, that he would find Luke messed up all sorts of details. But what he found was the opposite, that Luke was getting everything right, and he actually completely changed his perspective and worldview because of his archaeological findings.
Well, again, this discovery of this idea of the House of David at Tel Dan Steel, just very significant. And I thought I'd just keep moving, though, because when people think of the Old Testament, what about Ahab and Jezebel? Because we now know a lot more about them, and we even maybe know a little bit more about that orchard and all sorts of other things that are part of that story.
Yeah, we have attestation for both Ahab and even Jezebel, maybe surprisingly. So Ahab, he was the son of King Omri, so one of those two very famous wicked kings of the northern kingdom. And he was quite a powerful king, although the Bible doesn't dedicate a huge amount of text to his reign. But he is attested as fighting battles against and with other kings. In particular, the Assyrians name him on one of the steles of Shalmaneser III, and they even say that he had the most chariots of any of these kings that was in a coalition fighting against the Assyrians. So he was quite powerful. He had apparently more chariots, a larger chariot force than other regional kings in his area. And excavations at Jezreel, they think that based on what they found inside this big fortress there, essentially a parking lot where they think that the chariot corps of Ahab would have been stored when not in use out in battle.
So again, we just have all sorts of different kinds of evidence. I might just point also to a very good piece that was in the Breakpoint commentary by our good friend John Stonestreet about some of that as well. But one of the things that we did a number of years ago, Titus, is we produced these small booklets. I'll hold it up right now. One of those, this was A Biblical View on Archaeology. I was looking at the date. First of all, it's 2019, so it's 7 years old. I am planning to update it so I can include your book in it and all sorts of findings. But even back then, we were beginning to find evidence of Isaiah because we found this bulla or this particular section, which gives us the idea that indeed this was talking about an Isaiah that could indeed be the prophet of Isaiah, found at the same kind of layers where we also find information about Hezekiah. So what do we know about that? Because that's a very significant find as well, isn't it?
That was, and I think that sent some shockwaves through both academia and the public, because Isaiah is one of the most, if not the most famous Old Testament prophet, and yet before this discovery, we had no evidence outside of the Bible for his existence. Of course, we've got the great Isaiah scroll and the Dead Sea Scrolls, which you might argue is some evidence for him, although it's hundreds of years later. But excavations in Jerusalem uncovered this impression from a seal, the seal of Isaiah, and it said on it,
right,
Isaiah the prophet in Hebrew. And it was found right in the same area as another seal impression of King Hezekiah, who he served under. So this is, I think, very, very strong evidence for Isaiah and his role as the prophet under the rule of Hezekiah, just like we read about in the Bible.
And again, one of the things I do when I speak on this, not claiming to be an archaeologist like you, but certainly enough to be dangerous, is that King Hezekiah and the prophet Isaiah are mentioned together 17 times. So finding that at the same section in this particular seal, very, very significant. By contrast, we seem to know a lot about Isaiah, not as much about Jeremiah, but you have a chapter about that as well.
Yeah, that's right. So Jeremiah, who maybe he's the second most famous prophet, certainly very prominent, wrote 2 books. And we have, first of all, his scribe, Baruch, who is mentioned in the Bible. We have his seal impression that's been found. And why we can say it was him is because on it reads, Baruch, son of Neriah, the scribe. So it gives us his name, his family lineage, and his occupation. And it comes from the region of Jerusalem. It wasn't excavated, we're not exactly sure, but somewhere around the area, and it by typography, it dates to about the 7th century BC. But Jeremiah himself may even be named in what are called the Lachish Ostraca, or the Lachish letters.
Mm-hmm.
So these were written between the commander at Lachish and Jerusalem around the time that Nebuchadnezzar's army was attacking Judah. And it mentions the prophet in more than one of the letters. And of course, Jeremiah was really the only true prophet in Judah at that time. But we also have what appears to be the name Jeremiah there. Mm-hmm. Now, I say appears because these letters were written in ink on pottery, and some of the ink is very faded, so we can't see every single letter, but it does appear to be the name Jeremiah. So it's quite possible that we have Jeremiah and his scribe attested as well.
Let me, if I can, for just a minute, then maybe talk about people that aren't part of the narrative, but were very important. And years ago, we actually covered a very interesting story that came out in which it said ISIS accidentally corroborates the Bible. It turns out that the ISIS terrorists who were in Mosul, which is, of course, where the ancient city of Nineveh is, or was, they uncovered the remains of the Assyrian Assyrian palace of Esarhaddon, who you refer to. And so you have a whole section here about Sargon, Sennacherib, Esarhaddon, and so many of those Assyrians, which were, of course, coming against Israel, are all very well documented as well, aren't they?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, these are kings of what at the time was the most powerful empire in the ancient world, the Neo-Assyrian Empire. And so we should expect to find things like that. But when you find corroboration of specific events that are recorded in the Bible about those Assyrian kings, or even in their own records, they record mention of some of the kings of Israel and Judah. That's a little bit surprising, but very interesting. And then, of course, if you go back farther in time to the early days of archaeology, there were actually many scholars who questioned whether Sargon was even a real king, because he was mentioned in Isaiah chapter 20, but we didn't have any archaeological evidence for him. And now he's one of the better known and attested Assyrian kings.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll spend a little more time in the Old Testament. Let's look at maybe Nebuchadnezzar. The other day we were talking about Cyrus, so I thought that would be good, maybe Darius. Then we'll get into the New Testament. What about, of course, you hear people say all the time, do we have any evidence of Jesus? Well, yes, we do. How about Pontius Pilate? Well, we have his ring, or at least a ring with his name is on it, and, of course, a name on a place at Caesarea Maritima and much other places. But what about James and Peter and others? So I think we will certainly go through just a few of the very important names that show up in the Bible, which are attested to by archaeology. We'll continue that right after this.
Hey there, Megan Kitchen here, creator of the Highlights podcast. Sorry to interrupt, but I would like to ask a small favor if I could. If you appreciate anything about today's episode or it enhances your own point of view, would you please let us know? You can do it easily by sending an email to podcastcomments@pointofview.net. When you email us your feedback, it helps me to create more episodes based on topics that help you and your friends discern a biblical perspective on the world. So, penny for your thoughts? Again, that email is podcastcomments@pointofview.net. Now, back to the episode.
Again, author of a previous book, Unearthing the Bible. The one we're talking about, though, right now is Archaeology and the People of the Bible, exploring the evidence for the historical existence of Bible characters. And I thought, Titus, for just a minute, we might explain how each one of the chapters is put together. And I'll use Nebuchadnezzar as a good example, because you have the name, you have the time period, the geographical area, then the various places that it is referred to, where he, in this case, referred to 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel. And then you talk about the various sources, everything from the Ishtar Gate and the cylinders of Nebuchadnezzar, the Tower of Babel steel, and then, of course, a final identification rating, and you give it an A through whatever, and in this case, A, very firm. And this is a good illustration that anybody that would question the existence of Nebuchadnezzar, and I can't imagine anybody really would, they've got to deal with a lot of different archaeological finds, not just in the Middle East, but all the way in England, too. And so in some respects, we can establish the timeline and the activities, can't we?
Yeah, absolutely. So like you said, probably no one's going to be questioning the existence of Nebuchadnezzar, but what a study like this can do for a person like Nebuchadnezzar is just show where he connects to with the biblical narrative and some of the specifics of that. Things like Daniel, the book of Daniel, where he talks about he built Babylon, and then we can see from archaeological sources where Nebuchadnezzar himself claims he built this and that, and some of the buildings that have been excavated. Also, how long did he reign? So we can kind of see the timeline of what's going on through the book of Daniel, which is covers quite a number of years, decades. And so this is something that can really help, I think, fill out the historical context of narratives like the book of Daniel and 2 Kings, as well as corroborate some of the littler details.
I would certainly say that those of you that are Bible teachers are those who want to get into any kind of investigative Bible study. You'll find this so helpful because then it brings together all sorts of different pieces that maybe you have not been able to pull together as you are focusing on a particular passage, either to teach it or to study it yourself. But let me move on to Cyrus II, because we were talking about Cyrus the other day, in part because some people refer to President Trump as Cyrus, but more importantly, reminding the Jewish people, because even various leaders in, for example, Israel, like Benjamin Netanyahu, talk about Cyrus. And again, there is an individual that you have a firm number A rating on, because we have everything from the Cyrus cylinder. I'd love to have you talk about that, various inscriptions, as well as various historical accounts like from Herodotus and others. So again, we can establish with great certainty Cyrus II.
Yeah, Cyrus is another one of these extremely well-known and well-documented kings, and so people aren't really going to be arguing over did he exist, because he's so well-known outside of the Bible. But as you point out, the Cyrus cylinder, that's a very important artifact. And in terms of looking at the historical narrative of the Bible, one of the reasons the Cyrus cylinder is so important is because it essentially gives us the Babylonian version of what we read at the beginning of the book of Ezra. That is when the Babylonians are conquered and Cyrus comes in and he says to all these different people, you can go home now. And specifically, he tells the Jews, you can go back to your land, back to Jerusalem, and you can bring the things that were looted from the temple back with you. And of course, they end up rebuilding the temple. But the Cyrus cylinder is targeted more towards Babylon. And so it mentions Marduk instead of Yahweh, but it also talks about letting all these exiled peoples go back to their homes and bringing their religious objects with them. So that corroborates this specific command or decree that we find there in the Bible.
All right. In 2 Chronicles and Ezra, as you mentioned, Isaiah, Daniel, all are there. One other one I thought, and then we'll move to the New Testament, and that's Darius. And the reason for that, again, is that you have, again, a firm established idea. But more importantly, you have actual tablets. You have an inscribed golden bowl of Darius. And so as you go through the Old Testament, you begin to realize we can actually find very firm points at which we know these individuals were in existence. We know their chronology. We know when they were. We know what was happening at that general time. And then when you put the Bible next to it, it matches up perfectly.
Absolutely. And in fact, the Old Testament has more than one Darius mentioned in it. Darius the first, who you were just talking about,
right,
the Great, and Darius the second, who is mentioned in the book of Nehemiah. So we've got those distinctions. We've got the archaeological evidence for both of them, their time periods, their interactions, even in cases with things in the biblical text.
Well, we can go to the New Testament. Everybody's waiting for that anyway, I suspect. And the first one you talk about is Herod. Again, firmly established for a lot of reasons. Herod the First, so-called Herod the Great. We have a coin. We have the sarcophagus. We have all sorts of historical references. We have Josephus in particular. So coins, history, everything establishes that Herod indeed existed, and that's no real surprise to us.
Yeah, but I think something that might be a surprise to people is that if we read Matthew, we see the so-called massacre of the innocents, and people wonder, okay, why is that only mentioned in the Gospel of Matthew, or why is that not mentioned in Josephus? Did it really happen? But if we look into Josephus and we look into the details of Herod's life, what we find is that near the end of his life, especially, I mean, he was violent prior to this, but near the end of his life, he starts going on a rampage because he is paranoid about losing his power. You know, he heard about Jesus. He didn't want to be replaced as king, but he even killed some of his own sons in the last 3 years of his life because he was paranoid that they were going to try to take his throne. So we see how historically the profile of Herod fits absolutely perfectly, even with little passages like we have in Matthew that might seem odd to some critics.
We'll get into some other Herods as well, Antipas and Agrippa, but I thought for one, we might go to Pontius Pilate, because anybody that goes on a tour to Israel, and we've done this many times, you go to Caesarea Maritima, and they show a stone. Actually, it's a reconstruction, because the original is, of course, in the museum in Jerusalem, but in that stone, it has Pontius Pilate, the prefect of Judea. So for somebody to say, well, I don't think there was a Pontius Pilate, we have that. And if that's not enough, I did mention this in our booklet years ago, that they had discovered a ring over in the Herodium, which is over kind of closer really to Bethlehem, but they eventually developed the technology enough to read that it had the name Pontius Pilate on the ring. Now, I don't think it was one that he had. I think it was probably one that was used by a Roman official to show that he had the authority of Pontius Pilate. But here we have, again, numerous archaeological evidence of the existence of Pontius Pilate.
Yeah, we do. And that ring's sort of an interesting story, but because it was found decades ago. In fact, it was found even excavated slightly before the Pilate stone was, but it was never cleaned and examined until recently. But you look at the Pilate stone, that's in Latin, and then you look at this ring, and it's in Greek, and it's spelled exactly the same way as Pilate's name is in the Greek New Testament. So another great find, but also tells us that sometimes in archaeology things are discovered and then no one actually pays attention to them and examines them until many years later. So there's a lot out there waiting to be discovered and uncovered.
That means, if nothing else, for you, that's job security. There's always more to find, if nothing else.
Oh, yeah.
And we need to, of course, go to Jesus of Nazareth. And we have so many different sources. When people sometimes say, well, I can't even believe that Jesus lived. Really? I mean, we have all sorts of historical sources, and you spend a full paragraph just going through those. Then you have all sorts of other issues as well. You have the so-called Jesus cup. I want you to explain that in just a minute. Jesus the magician. You have the ossuary of James that mentions Jesus' name. And you just, every time you turn around, you have one other reference, either historical reference or archaeological find that points back to Jesus. But take us through a few of those, because it is, I think, encouraging to see how many different kinds of sources we have for Jesus.
Sure. So Jesus in pop culture is sometimes said to have been this legendary figure who maybe he existed, but we don't have historical evidence for him. But in the academic world, no professional scholar in archaeology or ancient history believes that. Everyone knows that he is one of the better attested people from antiquity. And as you mentioned, some of those historical references, I mean, we've got 5 people who lived in the 1st century who wrote and mentioned Jesus. That's Josephus, Serapion, Tacitus, Pliny the Younger, and Suetonius. And then you asked about that cup. This is a really interesting artifact. It's a fairly new find in terms of archaeological discoveries. It was discovered, less than 20 years ago, but it really hasn't gotten much press or publication. But it was a cup, ceramic cup, that was found in the ancient harbor of Alexandria, Egypt. And this cup has a Greek inscription on it that says, "Through Christ the Magician," dates to the 1st century. So it's using the title Christ. And if we go to a couple of other ancient references, we see that many people, especially in Egypt, thought of Jesus as some kind of magician. He performed miracles, and so Egypt was very into magic, and that was their explanation. The Egyptian magical papyri, they say that one of the ways that you cast out demons is by invoking the name of Jesus, God of the Hebrews. Kind of reminds me of Acts, book of Acts in Ephesus.
Right.
And then also you go to Celsus in the 2nd century, And he's actually a critic of Christianity, but he says that when Jesus was in Egypt as a young child, he learned magic, and then he went back to Judea and performed all these miracles and proclaimed himself God. So that is how people, in some contexts, thought of Jesus, as a magician. And so this cup seems to be attesting to that and his title, Christ.
Well, and again, the other part of that, and this kind of ties into James, because we then have an ossuary. People would be buried, and then later they would take their bones and put them in what's a box or an ossuary. And on the side, it has James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus, which, again, if indeed we assume that is if you will, the half-brother of Jesus, James, one of the disciples, you have that actually as an inscription on the ossuary.
Right. So I would say this, first of all, is that Josephus mentions James as the brother of Jesus. So this is a well-known association. But what's really unique about this ossuary inscription is that if you go and you review all the various ossuary inscriptions of this period, you will find that they will give the name of the deceased, and then oftentimes the name of their father, or the name of their occupation, or perhaps the city or region where they're from. But you almost never have the brother name. In fact, only one other inscription names the brother. But this one names the father and the brother. Brother's tacked on to the end there, suggesting that he was someone very important and notable, that they wanted to include that additional mention. And a statistical study was done using these names, the percentage of their use in first century Jerusalem and the population there, and came to the determination that this Jesus could fit less than 2 people statistically. So it's almost certainly talking about Jesus Christ, and we really have no evidence that it would be anybody else. We don't know of any other name associations like that.
Let me just pick one other one, just kind of fun, because when we take people to Greece, when you go to Corinth, of course, you pull up on the bus and everybody sees all the columns and everything, and we first take them down this little path, looks like a goat path almost, and people are wondering, where are we going? And we take them to an inscription that actually was a part of pavement outside of the city, and it has the name Erastus. Now, a lot of people go, well, why is that important? Well, it turns out that if you go to the book of Acts, you see that Paul had individuals with him, and Timothy, everybody knows who he is, but the other one was Erastus, but we didn't have any evidence of him until we find this inscription and find out that he was like a city manager or something of that nature. And so here, just one of those puzzles in the book of Acts, you can find in something as simple as an inscription that was uncovered years ago, and illustrates again that the Bible was accurate, and Luke was accurately recording our history right there in the book of Acts.
Yeah, that one's one of my favorites. I love to go and visit and see that inscription, and it's just pretty incredible that one of these minor characters who Paul mentions, and of course he gives his name and he gives his title, and he tells us where he's situated there in Corinth. So we've got a great identification for Erastus, one of the companions of Paul.
So we maybe did 20 out of the 130. That's pretty good, but if nothing else, that's a reason for you to get a copy of the book. It is entitled Archaeology and the People of the Bible, Exploring the Evidence for the Historical Existence of Bible Characters. And Titus, I thought for just a minute, we might just encourage people to contact you. Certainly the best way to do it. We have one link there to the Discovery Institute. That's probably a good way to contact you, but I suspect you would be available to come and speak on this book. Maybe teach in classes and things of that nature. So if people have questions or would like to maybe ask you about an archaeological discovery they've read about, they can do so, can't they?
Yeah. Inquire through Discovery Institute, and I do occasionally go speak at different conferences and seminars, and occasionally in other classrooms as well, although I've got quite a few of my own classes to teach.
But again, we appreciate the work that you're doing in that regard. And I just think that if nothing else, as I've said before, the fact that we have all these books coming out this year on archaeology illustrate again that we just have a wealth of evidence, and that should be encouraging to all our believers. And since we do so much in theology and apologetics, I certainly know that we're going to do a future updated booklet on archaeology, and we'll certainly include your book and other references to it as well. So appreciate you giving us some time today, and thank you for joining us on Point of View.
Hey, and thank you for having me.
Again, the book is entitled Archaeology and the People of the Bible, and that is one of many books. I know we have one on the Jesus discoveries coming up in about 2 weeks with our good friend Dr. Jeremiah Johnston, and I know Paul Weaver has a book coming out. And this, I think, just illustrates again that we are living in this golden age of archaeology, so we should be encouraged. Thanks for joining us, and I hope you again have appreciated all that we've talked about today. And don't forget that if you would like more information about what we're talking about, you can find it at the website pointofview.net. That's all we have for today. We look forward to seeing you next time right here on Point of View Highlights.